Welcome to Book Talk. To lose power at a general election is to fall like Lucifer. Ex-ministers used to having the media hanging on to their every word suddenly find themselves gasping for the oxygen of publicity. They're shorn of the deferential support of the civil service, powerless while others take the big decisions, and forced to learn new tricks in an unforgiving new environment. Just as well then that my guest today, the former Conservative Special Advisor Nigel Fletcher, has edited a book on how to make that switch from the power and glory of office to the bitter exile of opposition. It's called quite simply How to Be in Opposition. And Nigel, the chapter written by the former Conservative Education Secretary Gillian Shepherd's quite an interesting read as an example of what might perhaps be going on behind the scenes now. She describes the sheer trauma of the Tories' transition from government to that horrible state of opposition in 1997.
Yeah, I think trauma is the right word, because you have ministers of the Crown who've been used to having vast departments of state at their disposal, been driven around in ministerial limos, and yet suddenly, the day after the election, the removal van comes and goes in Downing Street, and the Secretaries of State, as were, then have to go and, Gillian Shepherd says in the book, queue up for their parliamentary pass alongside the cleaners. It's a huge adjustment, particularly for people who've been in government for 18 years, as some of them had been. And I think that's something that you've got to recognise in actually looking at adapting to opposition, is the personal change in the lifestyle of the minister, who suddenly finds themselves not just on their own in terms of their staff, but having absolutely no experience to base what they're expected to do. Being in government is a totally different skill set to being in opposition.
And the sheer brutality of the personal experience is quite interesting. I mean, there's lots of anecdotes in here about different oppositions over the years. Harold Wilson not being able to get a key to an office in Westminster.
Yeah, I mean, there's various things. I mean, there's the famous one where, which may be an apocryphal tale, where a minister gets into the back of a car and it doesn't go anywhere. A former minister gets into the back of a car. There's that one, but there's also a variety of things. Gillian Shepherd again says that she had to haggle with the whips to get a decent-sized room in the House, which is something most MPs have to go through. So there is this sort of indignity piled upon indignity that oppositions get. I mean, you'd have thought being out of power would be punishment enough, but actually they then find that they're given no resources, they're given no staff, they're given no training, and actually the experience itself is pretty miserable.
And I suppose that almost the worst thing of it is that no one seems to much care for a while after a general election what an opposition has to say.
No. Well, they get this brief period of sort of displacement activity where they usually have a leadership election. I mean, the Tories in '97 and again in 2001 and again in 2005. They have this brief moment where the press are interested in what they've got to say because they're having a leadership election. So they go through the summer sort of thinking, well, this is all right, we can have a press conference and we can have sort of people there, and it almost feels like being in government. And yet suddenly they then sort of get that over with, they have a new leader, and suddenly no one's interested again. And that's the most difficult thing for them to get used to, is the fact that the leader puts out a press release and no one actually pays any attention to it. And for someone who's been used to being even a Secretary of State, people hang on their every word. That's the most painful thing for them to have to go through, is the fact that no one much cares what they're thinking, particularly now, actually, where you've got the Lib Dems in coalition with the Tories. There's a unique dynamic there where you've almost got an internal opposition. So the media have got this different story that they can write about, sort of, well, what are the Lib Dems saying privately, what are the Tories saying? And so actually the Labour Party in a lot of ways are almost sort of superfluous to the narrative. So it's almost worse for Ed Miliband in that he's got the problem every leader has, which is that you struggle to get publicity, but also he's got the problem of where does he fit into this narrative. So it's an even greater challenge, perhaps, opposing a coalition than it has been opposing other governments.
But for all of that, Labour seem to be having rather more fun a year into opposition than the Conservatives certainly did in 1998, say, a year after they all lost so badly to Tony Blair.
I think it's noticeable that the Labour Party almost seemed to be more adept at opposition. It's possibly something to do with coming from being a party of protest. They seem more comfortable with the idea of attacking the government and sort of getting their hands dirty, going on protest, which is something which certainly Conservative leaders of the opposition didn't tend to do. So there is almost a feeling that they're more used to opposition. Obviously they had 18 years of it not too long ago, so it's perhaps within some of their their memories, particularly Ed Balls, who worked for Gordon Brown during their last period in opposition. I think it's probably a fresher memory for them than it was for the Tories after 18 years in government. But I think that they're still finding it difficult. I think you will have heard sort of various people giving interviews saying that, you know, you pull a lever and nothing happens, and that's a difficult thing for anyone to get used to.
And I suppose the other thing that parties have to do when they're in opposition is come to terms with why they lost, and if necessary attempt to sort of reinvent themselves, reshape their party, reshape their policies.
Yeah.
A bit early for that for Labour at the moment.
Well, it's a bit early to come up with detailed policy, but it's never really too early to start reshaping the sort of the bare planks of policy. Actually, opposition can provide an opportunity which, if a party takes it up, can actually help them in the longer term. In government, it's very difficult to renew your policy from sort of, you know, brass tacks, but in opposition, everyone is expecting you to go through a fundamental policy review. You're not going to be attacked for U-turns because basically you've been rejected by the electorate, so of course you're going to change policy. So opposition, in a sense, is part of the political cycle. I think that's why it's so important to study it and for parties to take sort of the lessons that they learned in government and try and sort of reshape their policy. But Churchill actually said that an opposition should be a lighthouse, not a shop window. So there is a sort of a feeling that you can't have too many detailed policies because, frankly, the government will steal them. What you should have is a sort of a guiding light and a sort of a sense of direction and where you're going.
But as in therapy, you've got to really want to change, haven't you? And it took quite a long time, for example, for Labour in opposition in the 80s to decide that it really had to change. It took a shattering defeat in 1983 to make that case. It took the Conservatives 2 terms in opposition before the David Cameron transformation began. Labour in this Parliament, I think, is not sure it needs to change at all, as far as I can see. Yeah,
well, it's always a danger that you spend your time sort of waiting for the electorate to turn around and apologise, and that's always a huge mistake that parties have. And I think Tim Bale's chapter in the book is particularly good at showing the sort of the way in which the Conservatives in opposition just didn't get it, and it took a long time for them to sort of come round to the idea that yes, we do need to change, and that's something which the Labour Party over 18 years also had a problem with. Neil Kinnock's chapter is brilliant in looking at the sort of the mindset of a party in opposition. He uses the phrase that a political party is a bit like a religious sect. There are these sort of shibboleths and truths that they hold to be sort of above all others, and it's very difficult for a leader to change that and to convince the party it does need to change.
And there is a certain sense sometimes that if you try to change the party policy, whether it's the Conservatives or Labour or whoever, if you try and change the party policy, it's, you're compromising with the electorate.
Yes.
You're selling your principles down in the hope of short-term gain.
Yes. Again, Kinnock describes that as electionitis, that people were accused of catching electionitis, this sort of strange affliction which involves sort of wanting to attract votes. And as he says, what is an opposition party for if it's not for trying to attract votes? So it's a difficult compromise you have to come to between not selling out your principles or not losing your core support, but also adapting to what the electorate wants you to do.
And there's also a new set of skills to learn. I mean, you alluded to it a little bit earlier, but once upon a time when you're a minister, you call a press conference and the world's press turn up to hear what great pronunciamento you're going to make. If you're in opposition, there isn't necessarily going to be a huge crowd waiting for you to unveil your new policies. You've got to learn more guerrilla skills almost.
Yes, I mean, the first thing to recognise is it's very much a David and Goliath contest. So you've got to try and use the slingshot. You've got to try and make sure that the rocks that you're throwing are well aimed and are going to have the maximum effect. And you do get sort of people who are very adept at this. Sometimes it's backbenchers in opposition who keep the House sitting all night and sort of wear down the government by calling votes at sort of 3 in the morning and things, and that's happened already. I mean, it happened in the Lords recently, and when the Conservatives were in opposition, the late Eric Forth was one who particularly sort of used to enjoy doing that. And those sort of guerrilla tactics are the type of things where an opposition can use what limited resources it has and what parliamentary tactics it can deploy to wear down the government. And of course, they're not going to win any votes. I mean, it's very rare for a government to lose to the opposition, but just by wearing them down and calling unexpected votes and engaging in what some people might call childish games in Parliament are quite important to keep up the morale of their troops and to wear down the government.
Well, it's wearing down the government, I suppose, but in a sense, does this parliamentary game playing have any resonance to the wider electorate? It may be fun for those involved, or not fun for those on the receiving end of it, but does anybody notice outside the Westminster Village?
I think it's important on two levels. The first one is just within the Westminster Village. I think the impression that the parliamentary party has of their leader is extremely important, because without their support they're not going to continue. But also those brief clips at Prime Minister's Question Time particularly are the ones which will set the agenda, and Neil Kinnock always said that he tried to use Prime Minister's Question Time as an agenda setting tool, because if he raised something at Prime Minister's Questions it would have to be followed up by the press. So those are tactics they can use to raise an issue, and Opposition Day debates are another one where you can get an issue running. But it's interesting that when William Hague was leader of the opposition, everyone said he was brilliant at PMQs, but it didn't matter. And then when he was replaced by Ian Duncan Smith, who wasn't any good at Prime Minister's Questions, people suddenly decided it did matter quite a lot. So there was definitely, again, a balance to be struck there.
And how about, though, the situation of the Labour Party in opposition now after such a long period in government? Are they doing the things an opposition should be doing if it's going to win again? Are they doing them yet?
It's difficult, really, to judge it. I think in some ways that, as you said earlier, they almost seem to be resistant to the idea that they've got to make any fundamental change. I think the fact that they're comfortable talking about cuts, and the fact that the nasty Tory sort of narrative is one they're all very familiar with, it's quite difficult for them to perhaps see whether that's resonating outside of the Westminster Village. And also it can mask the fact that they do need to make some serious long-term changes to their own platform. I mean, you can get some quite good short-term headlines, and you know that can sort of buoy you up for a while. But actually, if you don't then do the serious work of looking at the fundamental problems that got you booted out of office in the first place, then you might find yourself in a couple of years' time having made a lot of noise and upset the government quite a lot, but actually having nothing to offer yourselves.
Yeah, but there is, I suppose, almost a final thought. There's a line I rather like, that you know that parliamentary democracy is healthy if the state is paying a little tribe of opposition researchers to spend all their days trying to plot to overthrow the government of the day, and they can then go to a pub afterwards without being rounded up for questioning.
Yeah, exactly. I think particularly looking at the international situation at the moment, where we've got opposition movements sort of going onto the streets and being rounded up and persecuted and shot. You know, it is quite a uniquely British idea that you have people who, as I say, you know, sort of sit in an office, sort of talking at the water cooler, and their day job is bring down the government, and I think that's a wonderfully British idea, and long may it continue.
And at the moment we do have this, as you say, slightly different role for an opposition, because there's a coalition, there are two targets to take aim at, there's a game of split them perhaps to be played. Yeah,
I mean that's something we haven't seen before, obviously, and I think it's interesting how Labour have chosen to play it, and obviously they've picked off the Lib Dems as being the easiest target, but you're already getting some grumblings of discontent from Labour backbenchers and I'm sure front benchers in private as well, saying that, you know, we can't just pick off the Lib Dems, we've got to start taking votes back from the Conservatives, and there is an issue of strategy now developing, and it's not entirely clear exactly what Ed Miliband's strategy is. But one of the lessons that I think is most important to learn is you've got to have a strategy, and it's almost better to have a bad strategy than to have no strategy at all. And the worst thing you can possibly do is to start with one strategy and then abandon it halfway through. It's something William Hague ended up doing, where he went from sort of one idea to another and never quite fixed on a particular attack, and it's something which is always fatal.
Well, there's always the Travolta-McCorber strategy, staying alive and waiting for something to turn up. But Nigel Fletcher, thanks very much for joining us on Book Talk, and we'll be back again next week. Do join us then.